Hello and welcome to the 7th webinar in our ongoing series of sessions on implementing standards-based instruction with English language learner and emergent bilingual students. My name is Sarah Moore and I am Project Director of Education Connections, an initiative of the Center for Applied Linguistics in collaboration with the University of Oregon. Today we will meet again for 1 hour and end promptly at 1 p.m. Eastern Time or 10 a.m. Pacific. We are pleased to be joined by Tim Blackburn. Tim began his career as a teacher in rural schools of eastern Guatemala, then returned to his native New York City, where he enrolled in Teachers College at Columbia University in a program that converts former Peace Corps volunteers into teachers for New York City's high-needs, low-resource schools. While pursuing his master's in teaching English to speakers of other languages at night, Tim worked as a teacher of ESL and bilingual education. For 8 years, Tim taught high school ESL, global history, and Historia Global in Espanol to students from all over the globe in the Bronx. Tim now resides in Portland, Oregon with his wife and 2 little girls, and serves as an education specialist with the Oregon Department of Education. We are delighted to have Mr. Blackburn with us today. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Lindsay Massoud, who will moderate today's session.
Thank you, Sarah. We'll begin today's session with a brief introduction and overview of Education Connections. Next, we'll hear from Tim Blackburn. Following his presentation, we'll have some time reserved for questions and comments from participants, and we'll be monitoring questions as they come in, and we encourage you to send along any thoughts or questions that come to mind during the presentation using the questions box in the GoToWebinar window. During today's session, we'll also be posting some polling questions related to both your background and today's topic. Once results are in, we'll post them for you to view. At the end of the Q&A, we'll wrap up by briefly highlighting the Education Connections monthly lesson planning competition, which is currently underway for the month of March. We also invite you to join Education Connections via the link on your screen to access additional resources on standards-based instruction for English learners. We also wanted to mention briefly that we're currently in the midst of a snowstorm here in DC, which is very beautiful, but of course also complicates things for us logistically a little bit. So we don't anticipate experiencing any difficulties, but if we do, please bear with us and we'll work to resolve any issues as quickly as possible. For those of you who may be new to Education Connections, we just wanted to briefly introduce you to the community and resources available. Education Connections is a free online community that provides access to a wide range of resources and brings educators together to collaborate around implementing high-quality, standards-based instruction with all students and with English learners in particular. It is an initiative of the Center for Applied Linguistics and is hosted on the University of Oregon's Oberverse platform. Education Connections provides professional learning communities in which you can share best practices with peers around the country. We also post a wide range of teacher-oriented resources, including archives of all of our webinars and lesson planning tools, including lessons prepared by other educators and a lesson plan template. We also have a monthly lesson plan competition in which you can win $100. We also have a couple weekly features in our forums. We post Tuesday's tips and Fun Fact Fridays every week, providing tips and news to keep you informed regularly with practical ideas for your classroom. Everyone is welcome to join, so we invite you to sign up today if you're not already a member. As a reminder, we will be posting a video archive of the webinar within a few days. We'll also have a PDF of the PowerPoint available and some links to webinar-related resources. So once you log in, you just click on the Webinars tab and you'll see that information there. So we're going to post a couple of polls now just to get us started and learn about who we have here with us. So the first one that we're going to launch is, what is your current position? Are you a content general education teacher, ELL or ESOL teacher, administrator, or do you have another position? And we'll give just a minute for you to answer. Okay, great. So here are the poll results. It looks like we have a lot of people in our other category. Have some TESOL professors that have posted in the questions a TESOL student as well, so some folks who are in other areas of education, and a number of ELL teachers, not so many content teachers, so great. And now let's do one more. We were curious, how in your school do students receive EL services? So is it push-in, English as a second language, or English language development, pull-out, sheltered core instruction, or something else, some other kind of program model? All right. Great. So it looks like we have a lot of people working in schools and districts with pull-out ELD or ESL, a number with sheltered instruction, and a little bit fewer in push-in. So great. It's great to know. Get a little bit of context on who all is here, what kind of context you're working in. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim to talk with us about enhancing sheltered instruction. So I'm going to give you the controls, Tim.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Oh, sorry, I should have said Lindsay.
we're all a team. We're all a team.
Yeah, you're all sorry about that. Great. And so, here we go. Okay, so is this working all right for you guys? All right, so thanks very much, Lindsay, and just thanks so much for the invitation to meet with you all today. So I've been very excited about this because it's something very near and dear to my heart as a teacher.
Tim, sorry, real quick.
Yeah.
We can see you, but not your screen. So 1 second.
Okay, let me try that again.
Make you the presenter again.
Okay. How about now?
Yes, perfect. Sorry about that, everyone.
Good, all right. Yeah, screen share fail. Okay, here we are, everybody.
Moving along.
Yeah, moving along. So again, just something that's very near and dear to me. Certainly as an ESL teacher, but also as a content area teacher. I had the fortune to teach global history at International Community High School in the Bronx for a number of years. And the things that I'd like to share with you today really come out of that experience with my students and certainly with my colleagues. They say that necessity is the mother of invention. And while I learned a lot about sheltering in graduate school, for instance, it appeared to my colleagues and I that we really had to enhance that and look beyond sheltering and build upon sheltering to look for embedded, contextualized language development opportunities. So, today I'd just really like to discuss sheltering and content area access within the context of our new standards, within the context of the Common Core or the Next Generation Science Standards. And then really pick apart what that actually looks like through a Common Core aligned task. And probably most important, I really just want to connect you to a set of activities, a set of essentially formative assessments that build student readiness in academic skills, content, while also setting for language development opportunities. So really attending to making meaning of complex text, and then focusing on authentic expressive language tasks embedded within academic content. Now I should note that this presentation contains lots of links to examples of these studies and their, well, I should say examples of these activities, and they're deliberately designed for you to make use of them. You have to apply them within your own context. So the things you're going to see today are certainly from a social studies classroom in a high school. But one thing I would really encourage you to think about is how you might apply them within your own context. They draw heavily from lessons learned from, let's say, quality teaching for English learners, QTEL. Certainly you'll recognize some strategies from GLAD. Certainly you'll see things that is sort of an amalgam of constructing meaning and all of these things put together, but all designed really around these last 2 points here, is making meaning of complex text and then building upon that meaning making by designing activities, by designing tasks that provide embedded language development practices. So I hope you can make use of them, and in the future I do hope you'll reach out if you would like further support in using these tools. So we should really problematize this though, because I think this is you know, with all that is new and all the shifting that is happening, it's sort of important here to back up and look at this problem in general. And so I encourage you to read this, but as you're you know, soaking this in, I would just like to emphasize this quote from Coleman and Goldenberg that really highlight the emphasis on understanding class content, having, say, literacy skills and academic skills to make meaning of that class content. But the Common Core also tells us that we all have to be, that is, all teachers have to be teachers of language and literacy, but within our discipline. And so this is sort of uncharted territory for a lot of us. And knowing that there, unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of, say, content area or mainstream teachers joining us today, I think that this is an issue for all of us, really, you know, as an ESL teacher, having to understand the discrete skills and the type of language, the type of academic language our students need in order to have greater school success. And I think early on in my career, I don't think I really understood that very well, and that's where I feel like Kenji Hakuda, his metaphor is so strong. So I'm going to introduce you to myself in, say, circa 2005, and I'm this handsome cyclops here on the left, Mr. Language. And I think Kenji's metaphor here basically, you know, says that, you know, Cyclops, if he were a baseball player, he would indeed be a very terrible baseball player because, you know, Cyclops lacks the ability to perceive depth. And my students were really so spot on because, you know, thinking about, say, we used to use Betty Azar's grammar series, which are just a fantastic set of grammar texts. But one thing that became very apparent to me not so early on, I think at least 2 or 3 years of using these tools, realizing that while my students were linearly learning, you know, language, the function and the form of language, it wasn't necessarily connected to the language they needed for greater school success, right? So my students, after leaving my ESL classroom where, you know, things are going well, they would go into the content area, and my colleagues have the same issue. That there our uniform focus on, say, language standards versus and content standards, it's sort of a false dichotomy. You know, I had a colleague in the U.S. history classroom that was covering over 350 different performance indicators, basically substandards, little bits and chunks of knowledge throughout the year, and I should emphasize that we're covering. Unfortunately, in this sort of situation, you really can't do those things in depth. And certainly, you're not going to have the time that is necessary in order to isolate and highlight the discipline-specific language that our students need for success in a content area classroom. So, and this is a big issue because as the language teacher, I want to support my students in developing language, but I'm not necessarily developing the language, helping them develop the language that they need. And certainly in the content areas, Our students are struggling to make meaning of this complex information, and certainly the academic language to tie all that information together. So we really have to shift our focus here, and as Aida Walke tells us, is to focus on the language to communicate understanding. And so I introduce you, friends, to Mr. Language von Content. And this, I think, is probably pretty clear, is that shifting our focus to understand that this is better for our students in the context of schooling, that we have to help our students reason and communicate their understanding in a variety of contexts. And so this is really all about depth here. So I think one piece of work that is certainly and just very valuable to us, especially within the context of the Cyclops metaphor and focusing on the language to communicate understanding, is understanding and identifying high leverage skills. This is a correspondence document that was based on the framework document that essentially is the underpinnings of California's ELD standards, as well as the new English language proficiency standards from the ELPA 21 consortium. But I'd just like to bring this back to my own classroom and to my colleagues at International Community High School, because I really do feel like this captures the essence of what we attempted to do. We knew that, say, in our 9th and 10th grade global history classrooms, we had a blended classroom in 9th and 10th grade with students from basically all proficiency levels in the same class. Fundamentally, though, we knew that we had to support our students in this. So if you look in the center of the triple Venn diagram, that we knew we had to support our students in making meaning of complex texts. This meaning making was critical, and especially as our students are confronting grade appropriate text, and they might not necessarily be there. So having to think thoughtfully about the different scaffolds and how we'll have to differentiate those scaffolds based on our students' language proficiency levels. And so supporting them and finding evidence and understanding these complex themes within input, both in listening tasks and reading tasks, while also using that understanding to create a claim, that is to assert something and back it up with evidence. It's amazing, you know, I don't know how this even worked out, but this document came out in 2013. And my colleagues and I were having these conversations in 2009 because there's just such a need for us to really hone in on these critical skills that our students really needed for school success. So, you know, to extend that, we really started getting into task analysis, and so it became sort of a school process, part of our school culture, to think really critically about these three components here. And I should note that this diagram comes from a recent article that was published in TESOL, and it's from Valdez, Kibler, and Walke. It's a great paper, and I encourage you to read it. It's sort of a long one, but it's definitely worth it, and it's called Changes in the Expertise of ESL Professionals. And it basically just helps us understand our role a little bit better within the context of the Common Core, because I believe now, and this is my opinion, but I believe that our ESL, as an ESL teacher, that we as a sort of an ESL tribe are more important now than ever. And what this diagram really helps us understand are the dimensions of classroom tasks. That firstly, we really have to understand the concept, how to support our students and making meaning of a particular concept. That what lies at the heart of what you want your students to know, to understand. This point in the middle basically relates to analytical tasks. That is, you know, what are the sort of the academic skills? What are the habits of mind that your students will need in order to unlock those concepts, to be able to access those concepts? And thirdly, on the right side, what is the discipline-specific language your students need to not only to interpret those concepts, but also to express their understanding of those concepts. So this task analysis structure really did help us sort of understand more clearly, more acutely, what our students, what we'll really need to focus on in supporting our students in addressing Common Core aligned tasks. So these were essentially as a framework, they're dimensions for us to better understand classroom tasks. So thinking about that challenge that we read before, and with that task analysis structure in mind, this is a classroom task that we issued to our 9th and 10th graders. So our students had to craft a thematic essay, and for those of my colleagues in New York, you know what I'm talking about here. This is basically a Regents exam style essay, and in which the students have to craft claims to argue a theme. And they have to use evidence from their primary and secondary source texts in order to back up their positions. So for this one, we wanted our students to discuss the influence of technology, to describe and explain the influence of agricultural and industrial technologies on the economic and political expansion of the Islamic Empire. And they had to analyze and interpret primary and secondary source texts for evidence. So just take a careful look here, and I know this is probably very obvious why I did this, but to describe and explain, the analyze and interpret these high leverage verbs, these sort of bloomsy, juicy verbs here are very much at home in the Common Core. Certainly you notice that. So what we did is that we applied those task analysis lenses to a particular classroom task. So we actually did this task, right? So as part of our school culture, that as the teacher, I did this to make sure that I understood the complexity of these dimensions. So we essentially then applied these lenses on top of the work that we did. And so we really tried to analyze these discrete skills. So, you know, as far as like the analytical or academic skills, the content knowledge, what lies at the heart of what we wanted our students to know and understand. And then the discrete language skills that's sort of implicit in there, but we wanted to make them explicit. So on these academic skills parts here, we really had to focus on supporting our students and making meaning. Then we've got to tie all that together. I mean, how many, generations of children that I punished with writing thesis statements without really understanding that what a thesis statement is it's synthesis. It's a big, heavy cognitive lift, and I really felt like for years I sold my students short on this, that it is easier said than done. So knowing and being very aware that I have to be very supportive here is a critical component here. And to support that thesis, to support our students in weaving these ideas, we have to make sure that we have clear claims, clear cause and effect claims, because we're talking about impact. And that whole task analysis thing that we have to point out is that our students have to make meaning of those tasks too, to understand that underneath those task instructions is that we're not just going to have to compare and contrast or analyze for cause and effect between concepts, sort of conceptually. We also need the language to tie those things together too. And the language will also help us better organize our essays, and it'll help us develop our ideas better. One thing that, just a few things that we really wanted to focus on as far as content goes was cultural diffusion, and then applying our lenses of historical analysis is a very foundational skill in global, it's really in any history classroom. While also understanding how it is that empires grow, expand, contract, etc. And then here on the right-hand side, the language skills, it was really clear to us, especially through the lens of argumentation, that we had to hone in on cause and effect language, especially that as Dr. Margarita Calderon will teach us, that tier 2 vocabulary that will help us connect ideas. Additionally, we had to focus on adverbials for connecting ideas and transitions within the structure of the essay. And also the language forms for introducing evidence, that is, being able to describe, discuss, and explain, and sort of just draw our argument out and make sure that it's backed up by reasoning and evidence. And so throughout all of this, there's this sort of input and output sort of dynamic where we're supporting our students in and out of this complex content, and we're supporting them out of it with the language they need to articulate their understanding. So there's just a very heavy co-relationship in all of this. So implicit in that is that we have to be very thoughtful about not just our task design, but how it is that we're designing formative assessments all the way and building student readiness within the context of those academic skills, the content, and the language. And we're weaving that all together. And so I did want to point out one really helpful tool to us, and that is the depth of knowledge wheel. These, you know, if you picture the depth of knowledge as sort of the columns that hold up the Common Core, you know, foundationally. And to really think about what our students are doing with language. And so I just wanted to emphasize this, is that, you know, our students, you know, within that task, it's a big, heavy cognitive lift and really extending their thinking. So connecting and synthesizing and analyzing, and in order to do that, you know, they got to develop a logical argument, draw conclusions based on primary and secondary source documents, you know, analyzing, interpreting graphs and charts, etc., and using those as evidence to back up their claims. So here I think it makes sense. We're going to issue our next poll, because I'd love to get a sense of where you are in this era of new standards. So Lindsay, would you mind issuing that poll for us?
So the poll's closed now. There are your results.
Okay. I can't see them yet. So
You can't see them? Okay. So we have 64% that said yes, their state has adopted a new set of ELP standards. 16% no, and 20% were not sure.
That's good. All right, great. So thanks very much for doing that poll, everybody. So let's talk about those. So it sounds like you know, most of us here are you know, sort of navigating this new set of English language proficiency standards. And so there we go. In Oregon, we're an UPA 21 state. So these are our 10 new English language proficiency standards, and I just really wanted to highlight this task within that context. That what really lies at the heart of what we wanted our students to do was ELP standard number 4, is that they're constructing oral and written claims backed by reasoning and evidence. Okay.
Sorry, we lost your screen again. The polls sometimes sort of trip it up. So
yeah, that happens. All right, so can you see it now? All right, hopefully you can see it now.
I still just see you, actually.
Oh, gosh.
All right. Sorry about this all. I'm going to take back, and Tim, just guide me through the slides. Tell me when to switch.
All right. Very good. So we're going to go to the next slide, please, Lindsay. And keep going. We'll go to the ELP standards slide. There we go. All right. So what really lies at the heart of what we wanted to accomplish here was ELP standard number 4. And so by advancing the slide further, you'll see that we really tried to highlight that. Additionally, what we had to do was support our students in constructing meaning of that complex text so that they could actually have and understand the evidence they needed to support their claims. Also, what we knew we needed to do was to help our students use language in a purposeful way, that they're adapting their language based on the task. So we really had to make sure that they understood what the task was, and then that is actually, that's a big lift in metacognition, that I'm aware of what analysis is. I'm aware of what synthesis is, and I think early on when we asked ourselves, do our students really understand these concepts, what it is to analyze, what it is to explain, what it is to discuss? And we know we had to be very explicit about that. So ELP standard number 7 was very important to us. Now, underneath all of this, though, is that in order for our students to be able to argue their position backed by evidence, we had to be very clear about ELP standards 9 and 10. ELP standard number 9 is our functional standard that helps us understand, the type of language our students are going to use to connect ideas. And ELP standard 10 is the explicit grammatical form that our students need in order to do that. So thanks, Lindsay, for advancing the slide there. Keep it going. Let's just kind of highlight all those things I just talked about. There we go. So keep it going. So here we wanted to create opportunities for language development, but first we had to shelter for access, right? So if you could please keep it going, Lindsay. You can just go put it all the way through. There you go. Thank you. So we knew this is a definition from Echeverria, Vogt, and Short, making content comprehensible for English learners, and it's a really great definition. Here the content area standards are sort of primary, right? That we're facilitating access to those content area standards and skills. So while that's great, and it's that we used are here in that right-hand column. We tried to be very specific about our language and content objectives. We were mindful of what our students were bringing into our classroom as far as prior knowledge. Use a whole array of graphic organizers, especially to highlight those critical components of the metacognition. We did our best to use as much realia and demonstrations as pictures as possible, and just a lot of hands-on activities that we're going to walk you through. Thanks, Lindsay, for keeping it moving here. There you go. Oh yeah, and we also use differentiated texts, which you'll see in just a moment. So you can kind of drive yourself crazy though with all the planning structure. So we kind of found that that this is very cyclical. And so we started enhancing our sheltering through a sort of predictable cycle of formative assessment. And we're trying to be mindful of how we're building student readiness in academic skills, in content, and the language that they need. And so we found ourselves, after our task analysis, is working through a cycle of pre-reading, during reading, and post-reading tasks. Lindsay, please. So, and just work it through here. There we go. Keep it going. Good, good, good. So after that task analysis that we illustrated previously, it's going to reveal how and where we're going to scaffold. And then we get into these cycles of pre-reading, during reading, and post-reading tasks. A dear mentor of mine, I have no idea where I'd be without this man, and I hope he's out there listening. His name is John Balby, and he used to tell us abundancy and redundancy, that we create abundant and redundant opportunities in and out of complex text so that our students are negotiating and fussing with it, and they're building the capacity to make meaning of that text instead of watering it down. That we scaffold up to these complex texts. We're also being mindful of how we're weaving all of these things together. As far as pre-reading tasks go, we know that we're tapping our students' prior knowledge and we're bridging it into this new content. We're priming the context and vocabulary that they're going to need and sort of arming them with all of the themes and what they're going to need to make meaning of it. And they're also multimodal. Here we'll do a lot of listening and speaking and image analysis to sort of prime ourselves for what we're going to encounter in the text. Lindsay, please. And yeah, just keep it going here. And so there are also a set of during reading tasks that help our students negotiate the text in a meaningful and purposeful way. So if we think about what Aida Walke tells us about reading with purpose. So how do we read with purpose? As readers, we analyze our headings and subheadings, and we pick up all on just a myriad of different text-specific indicators that help us make meaning of complex text. But here what we want to do is create the framework in supporting our students as they interpret this information and helping them classify ideas. And later on, they're going to use this, basically the during reading organizers and all of these tasks, they're going to use these to support their ideas as they start to express their understanding of their texts. So here, we're finding evidence, we're analyzing for perspective, we're trying to figure out what is truly salient in a text, and it's really all about connections here. So this image on the right is a double entry journal. So for those of us that have taken QTEL training, this is basically just a repurposed double entry journal within the context of a global history task. Lindsay, please. So here's where language development opportunities are truly abundant. As our students have cycled through a series of pre-reading and during reading tasks, we really have to figure out how to craft and create language development opportunities embedded within that context. So this is an example of a post-reading task. This is sort of a collaborative poster, which is yet another QTEL strategy, but with some, I guess, some enhancements, so to speak. So we wanted to create the space for our students to engage and re-engage the anchored text. But we also knew that in order for our students to express their understanding of that text, that we really have to scaffold the form and the function of the language we need in order to address their larger summative tasks. So this is an example of a formative assessment that essentially scaffolds the cause and effect language that our students are going to need eventually on that thematic essay. But here, in just one little component of that, by focusing on, say, in this case, how did Islamic values influence economy? That is, how did Islamic values diffuse through economic exchange, right? So my students here went into their text. They're using their during reading organizers and their interpretation of the pre-reading tasks, and we're seeing the sort of the accumulation of that within one particular claim. We call these rainbow claims. So these rainbow claims are basically a way to check their work. It's almost algebraic in nature, that as my students would write their claim, and then they would go back to make sure that their parts of speech are in order. Now, it's not perfect. I know it's not perfect, but gosh, this activity went a really long way in supporting my students in understanding the sort of the discrete linguistic markers that they needed in order to draw cause and effect relationships. And again, all embedded within the academic skills and the content that they needed. So we couldn't have done this if we had not worked through those cycles of sheltering. But here we're looking for embedded language development tasks where they're really drawing on those analyses, and we're really honing in on the language that they're going to need eventually when they do this summative task. And it bears, reminding that when we go back to that correspondence document, when we look at those high leverage skills, these are things that our students, they don't need them just in global history class, they need them all day. Making meaning of complex text and then really honing in on the discrete language they need in order to do that. So we're building our synthesis, we're building our capacity to synthesize by connecting these concepts, and we're really honing in on the language that our students need in order to do that. Lindsay, please. So this is basically just a series of examples that I hope you're able to use and apply within your own classroom. But I'd like to, and really they're all basically embedded strategies, embedded tasks that you can use on your own, and I hope you can do so. So regardless of the context, you can use these. So Lindsay, one more time, please. Great, thanks very much. So one thing that, and Lindsay, if you could please select the link that says activity guide, that would be great. Now, I did want to work through one particular example here, and this is just to illustrate some of the scaffolding. And I realize I only have about two more minutes here, so I just want to focus on one particular thing. This activity guide is essentially a collection of all of the different formative tasks that our students are engaging through this whole pre-reading, during reading, and post-reading cycle. And so if you could advance down to, I believe it's page 12, Lindsay? Or it might be 13. One or the other. There we go, there it is. Now, Google Docs, it looks a little funky, but I did want to point out one particular post-reading task that essentially was the scaffold for that rainbow claims exercise. This is a great example of a post-reading activity because here we're creating the space for students to re-engage their text in a purposeful way. And so we're using these tier 2 markers at the top of the page there for it to support our students in connecting ideas. And so regardless of the prompt, our student organizer to help them not only organize their ideas, right, and these 4 separate columns, but also to connect those ideas with the discrete tier 2 language they need, in order to craft a cause and effect claim. So as a department team, we developed this tool. We embedded it throughout our instruction when we were focusing on cause and effect. And we had similar exemplars for compare and contrast and sequencing, and really all of those different language functions. So students build their claims here in a sort of a thoughtful and a deliberate way, and then later on they're able to apply their understanding of the language, the skills, and the content on their summative tasks. So I guess I'll leave it there. These materials are all there at your disposal, and I just want to make sure it's 9:47 here that we have enough time to talk about some questions and perhaps highlight some of, just to clarify anything that remained in doubt.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Tim, for all of that. That was really helpful. I hope everyone has found it really useful. And we've gotten some great questions that are coming in. So I'll highlight a few of these and send them over to you. I'll read these for the audience. Let me assign this to you.
Just as a quick note, I can't see them yet. So. Okay, there we go.
Just sent it over. Okay, so we have a couple here about content area teachers and language teachers. So we have someone asking, do you envision both content and language teachers adapting some of the activities you discussed today? You talked about the 2 cyclops of language and content, but often districts employ different teachers for each purpose, so it's hard not to have tunnel vision. Do you think one of the teacher groups would benefit more from these strategies? And I think sort of in a related note, someone has asked, how do you get content area teachers sold on sheltered instruction? Language arts teachers are easy, the rest are difficult. So could you talk a little bit about those questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to that first point, gosh, yes, it seems like sometimes our district level systems sort of perpetuate the cyclops. But if we really are thinking critically about supporting our students, throughout their school day, we really have to emphasize the importance of being very explicit about the discipline-specific language that they need for success in their classroom. So yeah, the tunnel vision, is sometimes a direct result of our own district systems. So I do think we have to address that. And no, I don't think one teacher group would benefit more from the other. I feel like there are lessons to be learned for both groups. As an ELD teacher, I had to have the awakening that, whoa, I really need to focus on the language my students need, outside of my classroom, because gosh, what I was doing wasn't necessarily supporting them in what they needed. And then secondly, I think our content area teachers need to really think about how we're spending time in class. If we're covering so many standards without much depth, it really sort of defeats the whole purpose of the Common Core and going deep. So for us at International Community High School, in a sense, less was more, because we were really deliberate about exercising content that we knew would be very high impact, while also being really emphasizing the academic skills and the language our students need. And in fact, one of my students, Hector, gosh, a lovely kid, he used to call my class History English. I'm in History English class because because we're doing them all together. But really thoughtful questions, and I hope I answered them clearly.
Great, thank you so much. And anyone else, if you have questions, please feel free to submit them in the questions box within GoToWebinar. We'll continue to take some of these and pass them over to Tim. So here's another one.
Oh, can I get to that? Sorry, Lindsay, I don't want to interrupt.
No problem.
But I didn't really answer that second question very well. Do you mind?
Yeah, please, by all means, go for it.
Sure. So one of my recent tasks, well, really one of my primary tasks at the Oregon Department of Education is supporting the adoption of our new English language proficiency standards. And so to Carlotta's question here about selling our content area teachers on sheltered instruction, I mean, we really just have to emphasize content area access and reaching each and every one of our students and being mindful about doing so. So our ELP standards, we have presented them as standards to our ESL teachers, right, to our ELD teachers, but we have presented them as practices for unlocking the Common Core to our content area teachers. I dare not call them standards for content area teachers because they're not their standards. But if you want a tool to help understand how and where to support your students in complex content, this is a good place to start because they're very in how they demonstrate the overlap between, say, ELD and content area and Common Core standards and next generation standards. Sorry to interrupt, Lindsay. That was just realized I didn't get.
Of course not. It's a really good question. So thank you for your thoughtful response. So we have another question here. It says, Tim, you mentioned that textbooks were challenging to use in your classroom, so you developed your own content that was tailored to your students' needs. Do you have any suggestions for other teachers who want to do something similar but might experience pressure to use a predetermined curriculum?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think, for many, Ida Walke talks about this really well, and she really lit a fire under me, gosh, probably about a year ago, when she was talking about curriculum, and curriculum really being the purview of teachers, that it's our responsibility to design curriculum because we know our students best. And remembering all the time that curriculum is essentially a plan for affecting learning. And oftentimes we confuse instructional materials with curriculum, that the textbook is not the curriculum, but the curriculum is our plan that happens to lever particular resources. So a very thoughtful question here, because we had in my classroom a set of like 6 different textbooks that cover the content in just really unpredictable ways, where like one textbook would cover Rome in like a page, like very generally, and then another would cover it in like 20 pages at significant depth. And so I just could not account for that disparity. So for us, it was really helpful to focus on text engineering. If you want to learn more about text engineering, one, you can talk to me and I'll walk you through it, because it's really a lot of fun. But Dr. Leslie Hamburger, she's at WestEd. She's also a really great resource in understanding how to create points of access within that informational text, especially like secondary source text. For me, primary source text or fiction, I really wouldn't mess with those. I wouldn't engineer those. But if you want to support your students in making meaning of class content within, say, science or history, economics, etc., and the humanities, text engineering makes everything a little bit more accessible.
Great, thank you so much for that response. So we actually have a question from Marguerite Lukes, who will be the presenter for our next webinar. And I know she and you have a bit of a connection through the international high schools in New York. And so she asked if you could share a little bit about your experience with the International Community High School as one school in a network of schools with a very clear model. She said a lot of what you're presenting sort of rings true with her based on what's done there.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that. And I'm sure Marguerite would agree that at ICHS and in the Internationals Network in general, the whole network is designed to be of a very specific, support for newly arrived students. And so many of, actually in that last question, sort of is very much in my mind as I'm responding to this one, is that we really had to respond very directly to student need. We couldn't just, I couldn't be the teacher, history teachers that I had. I had to be much more mindful of how I was structuring my classroom as far as creating the space for differentiation. I can't stand up there and lecture. I mean, that's going to fly over so many of my students' heads. So I really had to think creatively about creating the space for students to sort of homogeneously and heterogeneously to engage these tasks with very specific support. One thing that I loved about the Internationals also is that they foster that sort of creativity. That just a dear mentor to me, Verena Cabarcas, and my principal at ICHS, really empowered us to be creative. And so that, I mean, I guess within the model, it's just really encouraged. Also, collaboration. I had 3 hours a week of PLC time. I mean, amazing. 1 hour to work horizontally on curriculum, on basically consistency within our curriculum on our grade team. We also had an hour for case management and basically supporting our students with the interventions that they need. And then thirdly, we had our vertical planning time within our department, making sure that the work I'm doing in 9th and 10th grade is basically preparing our students for what they're going to encounter in 11th and 12th grade. So that very specific PLC collaboration with very high expectations for accountability, while also fostering creativity, I believe is just they remain with me as an educator, and the lessons I learned at ICHS are just very dear to me.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing about that experience. We really appreciate it. So I think we're getting close to out of time. We have some other really great questions that I would love to be able to send over to you, but perhaps there could be another forum for responding to some of these. We also have some requests for you to take this on the road and share with others. So I'll send those to you as well. People, it looks like some folks have really found this useful. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us, Tim, and your expertise, all of the experience that you've had working with diverse students in a number of contexts. So before we ended, we just want to quickly highlight our upcoming webinars. As we mentioned, we'll have Dr. Marguerite Lukes with us on Thursday, April 9th, to talk about dropout streamers and alternative pathways to college, creating viable options for overage undercredited ELLs. And in May, we'll have Dr. Wayne Wright talking about from Nickleby to Next Generation College and Career Ready Standards, will ELLs continue to be left behind? So stay tuned for information on those webinars. We'll post those to our website, to Twitter, to all the different ways that we get in touch with you. We also wanted to mention again and invite you to submit a lesson plan for our monthly competition. This month, if you submit a lesson plan, maybe one that you already use, that you've already developed, will actually help to add some sheltering strategies to that plan for you, and you'll still have the chance to win $100 there. So we just wanted to thank everyone again, and especially Tim for sharing his expertise, but thank you to each of you for taking the time to participate. We know some of you are using your lunch break to be here with us, so we're really grateful for all of your time and your efforts on behalf of English learners and all students. We hope this has been helpful. Feel free to reach out to our team, edconnect@cal.org, with any questions you have about the webinar or about Education Connections. Thanks again. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.